Caroline Pierce and Wendy Knell, 1987, Tunbridge Wells. Two bedsits, one killer, hiding in plain sight. Every town has a version of itself that people like to believe in, the safe version, the familiar one, the one made of shop windows, bus stops, restaurants, and quiet streets where ordinary lives move forward without fear. But sometimes, beneath that calm surface, there is another story waiting to be uncovered, and when it finally is, people are forced to look back at everything they thought they knew. In the summer of 1987, Royal Tunbridge Wells in Kent looked like the kind of place where life moved gently. It was a historic spa town, known for its old streets, local shops, and the chalybeate spring that had drawn visitors for centuries. But behind one ground-floor window on Guildford Road, a young woman's life was about to end. At first, there would be no name for the killer, no confession, and no clear path to justice. There would only be a locked silence that lasted for more than 3 decades. Her name was Wendy Knell. She was 25 years old, and she worked as the manager of a Supa Snaps photography shop on Camden Road. People who knew Wendy described her as warm, funny, generous, and kind. She had grown up in Tunbridge, where her family still lived, and she had built a quiet, independent life in Tunbridge Wells. She was also in a relationship with Ian Plass, a bus driver, and by all accounts, their future seemed to be taking shape. On the evening of June 22, 1987, nothing suggested that Wendy was in danger. She had spent time with Ian at his home, watching television with him and his mother. It was the kind of evening no one expects to become evidence. Later that night, Ian took Wendy back to her bedsit on his motorcycle. Around 11 p.m., he dropped her outside her ground-floor flat, kissed her goodnight, and left her at the entrance. That was the last confirmed moment of Wendy Knell's normal life. There was no public disturbance, no immediate alarm, no dramatic warning that something terrible was waiting just beyond that ordinary goodbye. But sometime after Ian left, someone entered Wendy's flat. Investigators would later focus on a rear window with a faulty latch, though there were no clear signs of forced entry. Whoever came inside moved through a place Wendy believed was her own. The next morning, Wendy did not arrive at work. At first, it could have been anything: a delay, an illness, a misunderstanding. But her mother, Pam Knell, could not reach her, and concern grew quickly. Pam contacted Ian, and he went straight to Wendy's flat. When he looked through a window, he saw a shape near the bed. He called out to her, but there was no response. Then he climbed inside and found the scene that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Wendy was dead. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. Her body had been left on the bed, covered by a duvet. Police searched the room and found details that made the case even more unsettling. Wendy's diary was missing. So was a distinctive key ring from Austria, with a small brass cowbell and a plate engraved with the words "Woman of the Year." Those items were never recovered. From the start, the investigation carried a question that nobody could answer. Had Wendy been chosen at random, or had someone been watching her? For the people of Tunbridge Wells, the murder shattered the feeling of safety that surrounded the town. Investigators gathered forensic evidence, interviewed witnesses, and examined Wendy's final movements. But in 1987, DNA technology was still limited. The National DNA Database did not yet exist. The police had physical traces and suspicions, but not the one thing they needed most: a name. 5 months later, the fear returned. Caroline Pierce was 20 years old. She worked at Buster Brown's restaurant on Camden Road and lived in a bedsit in Grosvenor Park. Like Wendy, she was young, independent, and living alone in Tunbridge Wells. The two women are not believed to have known each other, but the similarities between their lives would soon become impossible for investigators to ignore. On November 24, 1987, Caroline spent the evening with a colleague. They watched the film Little Shop of Horrors, then went for a drink in town. Around midnight, Caroline was dropped off by taxi outside her home. She was wearing a long black skirt and a red jumper. She was only moments away from being safely inside, but she never made it. Neighbors later reported hearing screams outside the property. One witness described a scream lasting around 30 seconds. Another remembered hearing several screams. Then Caroline disappeared. Her flat gave no simple explanation for where she had gone, and her keys, which had a Buster Brown's restaurant fob, were missing. For 3 weeks, her loved ones were left in uncertainty while police searched for answers. On December 15, 1987, Caroline's body was found nearly 40 miles away in a water-filled dike near St. Mary in the Marsh on Romney Marsh. She was naked except for a pair of tights. Like Wendy, she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. The discovery turned one murder investigation into something far more frightening. 2 young women had been attacked months apart. Both lived alone in bedsits. Both worked in the same town. Both had been killed with a level of violence that suggested the same offender. The cases became known as the Bedsit Murders. Detectives pursued leads and considered whether the killer had knowledge of the victim's routines or the local area. There were reports of prowler activity in the period around the murders, with women describing someone looking through windows. Investigators also preserved forensic samples, though the science of the time could not yet give them the breakthrough they needed. The killer had left traces behind, but the technology to fully read them had not caught up. Years passed, and the case grew colder. Public appeals continued. Police reviewed old evidence as forensic methods improved. For the families, time did not soften what happened. Wendy's parents, Pam and Bill Knell, lived with the pain of not knowing who had killed their daughter. Bill later said that his greatest fear was going to his grave without answers. In 2017, nearly 30 years after Wendy's murder, he was seriously ill with cancer and made another appeal for information. He died in May of that year, before justice came. But the evidence remained. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, investigators were able to do more with the samples they had preserved. A DNA profile connected to Wendy's case had been developed, but there was still no match. Then, in 2019, enhanced testing helped link the murders more clearly through forensic evidence, including material recovered from Caroline's tights. Detectives used modern DNA methods to search for possible relatives of the unknown killer. A long list was narrowed until one man came into focus. His name was David Fuller. Fuller had been living in Heathfield, East Sussex. He was born in 1954 in Deal, Kent, had completed an apprenticeship with the Ministry of Defense, and worked as an electrician. On the surface, his life appeared unremarkable. He had been married more than once, had children, and had interests that sounded ordinary: cycling, photography, and birdwatching. He had even followed the band Cutting Crew as an unofficial photographer. But there were details in his past that suddenly mattered. In the 1970s, Fuller had convictions of creeper-style burglaries involving entering homes through windows. He had lived in areas connected to the case, used Supasnaps where Wendy worked, and diary evidence showed links to Buster Brown's where Caroline worked. He also knew the Romney Marsh area where Caroline's body had been left. These facts did not stand alone. They were part of a pattern that only became clear decades later. On December 3, 2020, police arrested David Fuller at his home. He denied knowing Wendy and Caroline and denied knowledge of places tied to them, but the forensic evidence told a different story. His DNA matched the killer's profile, and his fingerprint matched a bloody print found at Wendy's flat. After 33 years, the man behind the Bedsit murders had finally been identified. But when detectives searched his home, the case changed into something even more disturbing. They found hard drives, CDs, floppy disks, and hidden storage devices containing a vast archive of images and videos. What began as a cold case murder investigation exposed a second series of crimes committed over many years inside hospital mortuaries. Fuller had worked in electrical maintenance at the now-closed Kent and Sussex Hospital and later at Tunbridge Wells Hospital in Pembrey. His job gave him access to areas that should have been protected. From at least the mid-2000s until 2020, he abused the bodies of more than 100 women and girls, ranging in age from a child of 9 to a woman of 100. He photographed and filmed his crimes. A later inquiry found serious failures in the way mortuary access was managed. Fuller knew where cameras were not installed. He entered restricted spaces repeatedly and was not properly challenged. In 1 year alone, he entered a mortuary hundreds of times unnoticed and unchecked. Behind the ordinary image of a maintenance worker was a man who had continued offending in places families believed were safe. In 2021, Fuller admitted murdering Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce. He also pleaded guilty to dozens of offenses connected to the mortuary abuse. During sentencing, the judge described him as a vulture and told him he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The sentence was a whole life order, meaning he would never be released. For Wendy's family, the guilty plea brought truth, but not peace. They had spent 34 years wondering what had happened to her in her final moments. When they finally learned the full reality, they said it was worse than they had ever imagined. They asked that Wendy be remembered not only for the way she died, but for the person she had been: kind, caring, generous, funny, and loved. Caroline's story carries the same weight. She was 20 years old, returning home after an ordinary night out when her life was taken outside the place where she should have been safe. Her murder left a family and a community with questions that lasted for decades. Even now, when the legal case has been answered, the emotional damage remains beyond measurement. The Bedsit murders are no longer unsolved. David Fuller is in prison, and the evidence that waited for decades finally spoke. But the case still leaves behind a colder question. How many times did people pass him in ordinary life without knowing what he had done? How many systems failed to notice him? How long can evil hide behind routine, politeness, and a familiar face? Wendy Knell was 25. Caroline Pierce was 20. They had families, friends, work, plans, and futures. Their lives should not be remembered only through the man who ended them. They were young women who mattered before the headlines, before the court case, and before the name David Fuller became known. For more than 30 years, their families waited for the truth, and when it came, it proved that some evidence does not disappear. It waits quietly, preserved in the past, until science, persistence, and time finally bring it to the surface.